and first of the talks will be about the micro-frontend revolution using Webpack 5 module federation with Angular, spoken by Manfred Steyer. So Manfred is a Google developer expert, trainer, consultant, and programming architect with focus on Angular. Besides that, he is a trusted collaborator in Angular team and writes for O'Reilly, German Java magazine, and Windows Developer publication. He regularly speaks at many conferences. So please welcome Manfred.
Hey, good morning.
Hey, Manfred, good morning. How is it going?
Yeah, fine. So here we have a bit of snow in Austria, and it really looks nice when I'm looking out of the window.
That's exactly what I wanted to ask you, like, where are you currently located, and like if you already got some snow. So that's nice to hear.
Yeah, it's a nice landscape
around, I guess, huh? Like a lot of mountains around where you live.
I'm living in the south of Austria. There are not that much of mountains, but there are a lot of hills, you know, and I live on the countryside, so there is a lot of landscape, trees and woods, and now snow.
Sounds like a very nice scenery to wake up to. So let's not delay any further and let's jump into the talk.
Cool, great.
Please.
So let's get started, yeah. So this will be about module federation with Angular, which is triggering the micro-frontend revolution, if you ask me. And I want to start with a very smart Italian, namely with Leonardo da Vinci. Perhaps you know him. He designed a helicopter already back in 1400 something. In 1400 something. Of course, he couldn't build this helicopter because he lacked of the material. He didn't have the right material, but scientists built it several years ago and they found out it really flies. So this is quite amazing if you ask me. And this story came in mind when I thought about micro-frontends, because in the area of micro-frontends, we have a very similar situation. But first of all, what are micro-frontends? Well, a micro-frontend is just a tiny piece of the overall system. The idea is to slice a bigger system into tiny applications, and those applications are called micro-frontends. We are doing this mainly to scale teams, because now we can assign a team to each of those applications, and they can work independently. They don't need to coordinate with each other. They can do their own decisions and they can deploy independently. That means they can provide business value on a regular basis. But the thing is, the user wants to have one integrated application. And so we need to find a way to load all those tiny applications into a bigger overall application. I'm calling this the shell application. You see it here. Here on the left, you have a shell. You have here the navigation options, and this shell loads on demand one of those micro-frontends. Here, I'm only loading one micro-frontend, but in real world, you would load all the micro-frontends belonging to your system. And as you see here, the micro-frontend runs on a different origin. It runs on localhost 3000. With this, I want to stress that micro-frontend can be individually deployed somewhere on some server, and then we can load it into our shell, which in this case runs on localhost 5000. And to come back to Leonardo da Vinci, this is exactly the same situation as with the helicopter, because the idea is quite old. The idea is anything but new. But in the former years, we didn't have the right material to build it. We didn't have the right technologies. But this is changing now. With Webpack 5, this is changing because Webpack 5 gives us what they are calling the module federation. And this is what this whole talk is about. In this talk, I will show you 3 things regarding module federation. First of all, I will start talking about module federation in general. Then we talk about what I'm calling federated Angular. That means we will use module federation together with Angular and the CLI. And then I will give you a roadmap so that you know when you can use it. But first of all, let me introduce myself a bit. I am Manfred. I'm a trainer and consultant. I'm doing a lot of in-house trainings and consultancy, mainly in the area of Angular architectures and Angular for enterprise applications. I'm quite connected to the Angular community. I'm doing a lot of stuff in the German language area. I live in Austria, but I spend a lot of time in Germany, and I'm always happy when I can work with people in other countries around the world. Okay, so let's get started with the first part here with module federation. So the big question module federation is answering is how to load separately compiled code. That means we have somewhere code that has been compiled, it has been deployed over there, and now we want to load it into the middle of our shell. Perhaps you're saying, come on, Manfred, that cannot be that difficult because we have import and even before we had require. So why not use those statements to point to another application in order to load it? Well, the thing is, in theory, that works. But in practice, this does not work because of limitations current bundlers bring. For instance, Webpack. Webpack does not allow this. And so also the Angular CLI doesn't allow it because the Angular CLI bases upon Webpack. The thing here is that most bundlers assume that everything is here at compile time. Everything needs to be known at compile time. Everything is compiled together, everything is optimized together, think about pre-shaking, and then, and only then, it is cut into chunks for lazy loading. But this is too late for our purpose, because we don't know those stuff upfront. We want to load it at runtime from this or that origin. To solve this issue, Webpack 5 introduces module federation, and module federation in turn introduces two roles. The first role is called the host. I call it the shell. And the second role is officially called the remote. I am calling it the Microfrontend. And now you can configure both roles with a Webpack configuration. For instance, for the shell, you could map paths. You could say, hey, I have this path MFE1, stands here for Microfrontend 1. I know, very creative. And this points over to another application, this path, this URL. And by the way, over there, it's also called MFE1. That means here you can define an alias. You can say what's called MFE1 here is called MFIE7 over there. You don't have to go with the same names. Over there, within the remote, you can expose stuff. For instance, you can say, hey, I have this file with this component. Let's expose it under this name. You can do the same with ng modules, even with functions or classes. And now something beautiful happens. Trust me, now something really beautiful happens. You can import this stuff that has been exposed over there. We can import something from over there, even though it was separately deployed and separately compiled. So, of course, the shell needs some metadata of the Microfrontend. And this metadata is compiled into a so-called remote entry. When we build the Microfrontend with Webpack, Webpack emits this remote entry. It is just a tiny file, and this tiny file contains all the metadata. For instance, the URLs to use, but also dependencies to use. And of course, this metadata needs to be loaded into the shell. We can load it up front, like here, but there are even more dynamic ways. We can trigger helper functions to load this remote entry. The best thing of this is we can share libraries. That means we can define that we want to share Angular core on the left side, that we want to share Angular core on the right side. And now those both roles will agree upon just using one instance of Angular. They do some negotiation using the metadata I've mentioned before, And during this negotiation, they will agree upon the highest compatible version. So let's say the shell is using Angular 11 and the micro frontend is using 11.1. In this case, 11.1 is the highest compatible version, and they will agree upon it. They will use 11.1. Of course, now we need to combine all this goodness with Angular and especially with the Angular CLI. And now we have an issue because the good message is behind the Angular CLI, we have Webpack. Webpack is used underneath. This is good. But the bad message is that Angular CLI shields Webpack from us. Most of the times, this is also beneficial because we don't want to get in touch with all the complexity of Webpack. But now this is an issue because on the other side, we have our module federation config, and somehow we want to delegate it to Webpack underneath the covers. And now we need a solution for this. And fortunately, there is an official solution. We could write a custom builder. The thing is that the Angular CLI is not delegating to Webpack directly, but indirectly using a builder. A builder is an exchangeable strategy. Think about it like about a driver. You can exchange it, and this builder delegates to build tools. The default builder for building an Angular application delegates to Webpack. So what we can do now is we can create a custom builder which delegates to the default builder. And when doing so, it can also pass the module federation config to it. Yeah, and then the default builder can do what it does all the time, delegating to Webpack, but also delegating the module federation config so that Webpack is doing the rest. Of course, you could write such a builder by hand, but you don't have to because I've written such a builder already for you. You can install it under this name, Angular Architects Module Federation. And basically, this thing does three things for you. First of all, it generates the skeleton for your module federation configuration. That's the first point. Secondly, it installs this custom builder, which enables module federation. And also, for the sake of debugging, it assigns a new board to your Angular JSON so that you can serve your different micro frontends side by side. The usage of it is right straightforward, if you ask me. You need to ng add it. Then you need to adjust the generated configuration. And then you need to ng serve everything to try it out. So much for the theory. I would say let's have a look into a demonstration to find out how this plugin works and, which is more important, how module federation works. For this, I have already prepared two applications, namely a shell and a micro frontend. And here, when I'm clicking to flights within my shell, we see that nothing happens. It just says not implemented yet, because this is now our job during this live coding demo. That means what I will do now is I will tell module federation to load this micro frontend into the working area of my shell. And for this, we need some prerequisites. Then I'm switching to our project, and if we look into our package JSON, we see that I'm already going with Angular 11. You see Angular Common, Compiler, Core 11. That's not a big deal. I mean, it's the newest version. If we scroll down, we also see I'm already using CLI 11. It's also not a big deal because it's also the newest version. But the thing is, the CLI still ships with Webpack 4. And Webpack 4 does not support module federation. Module federation is available for Webpack 5 and upwards. The good message here is that CLI allows us to opt into Webpack 5. It's an experimental opt-in, but they did their best to make it work. Well, it's still experimental because some features and edge cases might not work. but you can start with it, and so you can start experimenting. To opt in into Webpack 5, you just need this section here, resolutions, Webpack 5 and above. And now when you install everything with Yarn, don't use NPM. Yarn will respect this. NPM isn't out of the box. Then you get the CLI and all the other dependencies forced into Webpack 5. Okay, this is our prerequisite. So we have told the system to use Webpack 5. The next thing I will do is I will enable module federation for the shell and for my microfrontend. So let's switch to the console. Let's close ngserve. Let's clear the screen and let's add Angular architects module federation. This will now download the package. This takes 1 second or another. And then it asks me which project of my mono repo I want to enable for module federation. After that, it also asks me which board I want to use. Here I'm saying, hey, let's go with the shell. And by the way, for the shell, I want to use board 5000. Now, some stuff is generated and updated for me. I get a skeleton of a Webpack config. It's not a huge overall Webpack config. It is just a tiny Webpack configuration, just with the things we need for module federation. And having a skeleton here is a good thing because this prevents me from the need to learn everything by heart. I will just correct tiny pieces in here and then I will be fine. Also, Angular JSON is updated so that this custom builder is used. The custom builder that delegates to the default builder and enables module federation. Let me do the same for the micro frontend. Let's switch over here to my second tab. I'm also closing this run of ngserve. And here I'm doing the same. ng-add. I'm getting the question, which project do I want to enable? Let's go with MFE1. And here I want to go with board 3000. The same things happen. Now I would say, let's have a look into the Webpack config of our micro frontend one. Here we have my sample mono repository. There is a projects folder. And here we have MFE1. In the root of MFE1, we have a Webpack config. There is some boilerplate, of course, but if you look here, it is not much. Just 1 or 2 pages regarding to your resolution and font size. The most important thing in here within the skeleton is the module federation plugin. This plugin enables module federation within Webpack. And here we have 2 sections. Both of them are commented out. The first section is for remotes or for micro frontends, and the second section is for hosts or for shells if you want to use this term. So MFE1 is a remote, a micro frontend. So let's uncomment this section. I'm configuring the name of it. I'm configuring the name of the remote entry point, and I'm configuring the things I want to expose. In this case, I want to expose a module, and I'm calling it flights module, flights.module.ts. I don't need the second section because, as mentioned, this is just for hosts. So let's get rid of it. And here I have a list with my shared libraries. Before on the slides, you've seen a simpler version of this shared property. The simpler version is just taking an array with all the libraries you want to share, for instance, Angular core. Here I'm using a more complex version. I'm assigning an object, and this object allows me to configure my shared libraries. Here I'm saying with those 2 properties, I do not want to load different versions of Angular, different non-compatible versions of Angular. Having Angular 11 and 11.1 is okay. In this case, we can agree upon the highest compatible version, which would be 11.1. but having Angular 9 and Angular 11 would not be okay according to the settings, to completely different major versions, because according to semantic versioning, different major versions are not compatible to each other. That means when module federation detects two not compatible versions at runtime, two different major versions, we will get an exception. If we would skip strict version, if we just would go with singleton, we would just get a warning. A warning that tells us, hey, this might not work, perhaps you are lucky, perhaps not. Here I'm the strict guy, I'm saying no, I'm forbidding this. If we start and if we see two non-compatible version, let's throw an exception, let's fail fast. I'm doing the same for Angular Common and the Angular router. Okay, so everything is configured here for the micro frontend. And if we look into the exposed module, we see this is just a traditional Angular module. A traditional Angular module with child roots. That means if we route to this micro frontend, we can directly jump to those roots defined within here. That was the first part, the view of the micro frontend. Now let's switch over to the shell. If we see here this project, we also have a shell inside of here. And here the shell also comes with a Webpack config skeleton. It looks about the same. Here we have a module federation plugin. I don't need the first section because this is for remotes, for micro frontends. The second section, as mentioned before, is for the shell, for the host. Here I need to point to my micro frontends. I can say, well, I want to point to MFE1, and MFE1 is located at this URL. This is the URL of its remote entry point. Of course, here this is hard-coded, and hard-coding this is not that beautiful. It is quite nice for testing and for prototyping, but in real world, I would go with dynamic federation, which means I would call some helper function, something like load remote, and then I will pass in the location of the remote entry point, just on demand. Of course, I need to adjust my board here. The board here is, let me think, 3000. My micro frontend one runs at board 3000. And here we have some shared libraries. It's the same as before. If we look into this shell more closely, we also find a routing configuration. Here we have an app routes.ts file. And within this routing configuration, we could introduce this lazy route, a lazy route pointing over to MFE1 module. Now at runtime, when Webpack detects this route, it will do its job. It will fetch the module from over there and load it into our shell. And as mentioned before, Angular does not even recognize that we are routing to another application. For Angular, this is traditional lazy loading. That means we don't need any extras. We use Angular as all the time before. Of course, TypeScript is not amused. TypeScript is saying, TypeScript is saying, hey, I don't know this file here, so I cannot compile this. And we now need to tell TypeScript, come on, TypeScript, ease yourself, trust us, this will exist at runtime. I know you don't know it, but trust us, we are experts. It will be there at runtime. And for this, we need a DTS file. The name doesn't matter. If it ends with DTS, TypeScript will pick it. And here we can define a typing for MFE1 module. Now the TypeScript compiler is fine, and it allows us to use this URL. Yeah, and this should be everything. As you see here, we are just routing to another application. So let's try this out. Let's jump back to the console. Let us start the shell. Let me also start MFE1. And let's have a look to the output here to make sure that everything works. Yeah. One more time, this is an exercise in patience. The shell is coming up. Yeah, everything is green here. That's good. When it's green, we can ship it. No, please don't do it. Also here within the micro frontend, everything is green. Here we see my shell. Let's reload it. And now let's click on flights and hey, our micro frontend has been loaded in the middle of our shell. Even though it's a separate application, it has been loaded. Let's have a look underneath the covers. So here we have our network tab. Let's go to home. Let's reload everything. Let's clear this. Now, one more time, let's click on flights and check. You see the common JS file is loaded on demand. It only has 12.6Ks in debug mode. And this clearly shows that we are not reloading Angular itself. This clearly shows that Angular is reused, Angular is shared between the shell and the microfront. And if you say, hey, this is just lazy loading, no, this is more, because here we have localhost 3000, here we have localhost 5000. This really proves that we are loading something that has been deployed separately. Awesome, isn't it? I hope you are as excited as I am about this. Of course, now you are wondering, what's the roadmap? When can I use this safely? Well, the first good message is Webpack 5 is final, so you can use it for production. The second good message is CLI 11 is final. And a neutral message is CLI 11 allows us to opt in into Webpack 5. This is an experimental opt-in. They did some efforts to make it work more or less, but they haven't heavily tested it. They have heavily tested it with Webpack 4. That means you can start now experimenting within, defining your architecture with it. And perhaps you start with 1 or 2 micro frontends. They could be separate applications. And when we get CLI 12 this spring, in spring 2021, then you can go fully federation, and then you can integrate your separately developed and deployed micro frontend into a shell. Until then, you have an experiment and 2 separate applications. If you like this presentation, you might also like my ebook. It's here on angulararchitects.io/book. You can just download freely, and it contains a lot of stuff about micro frontends and several chapters about module federation. Okay, let me sum up everything. We have seen that module federation is really a game changer because it allows us to load separately deployed code. And this in turn allows us to scale our teams. Different teams can work individually on a product. We've also seen that this is an enabler for micro frontends. It is the missing link, the missing technology for micro frontends. And we have also seen we can combine it with Angular. I'm calling this federated Angular. Just use this plugin we've seen before, and you are good. And there is one last thing I want you to remember, namely, this is your chance to become the next Leonardo da Vinci. This is your chance to create something that is really new, that hasn't been possible before. So take your chance. So thanks for having me. I've already uploaded my material and examples. You find it here in my blog. And if you like, follow me on Twitter so that we can stay in contact. Thanks for having me.
Hey, Manfred, thank you very much for a very interesting talk. Before we proceed to Q&A, folks, don't forget to post your questions in the chat in the Hopin. And I have to say, like, like me personally, like I really like this new approach because it like brings like the isolation to a totally new level. As you said, like it's not just the lazy loading because those things run on different URLs. So they are deployed like independently. So this opens up so much new possibilities. So it's like really exciting time to like be around and like leverage all these new things. In terms of questions, you mentioned there like in that Webpack configuration that like in a real life scenario, which is not just like an example, you would use basically like a dynamic module federation where you would like retrieve those configurations using some function. The question is, would this be like runtime or build time? Because like Webpack configuration is usually like something which runs on the build time, right? So how would that work?
Yeah, good question. So the thing is, at runtime, there is still a little tiny piece of Webpack. I'm calling it the Webpack Runtime API. You find it in the global scope and you can use it to load at runtime another micro frontend.
Okay. Now we have another question from Simone, which is asking how this would work like together with like live reloading, because with the CLI we are kind of used to like the situation when we make adjustments to our code, right? Angular compiles it, the CLI, and then like the browser refreshes itself. So what would happen like from the point of view of the shell and from the point of view of the micro frontend?
Yeah, it's also an important thing. So the first thing is you could always create an NPM package, install it, and then share it between your micro frontends and your shell. But you can even go one step further. You can create a library within your monorepo, and you can define that you want to share this library between the micro frontends and the shell. Of course, in this case, the library does not have a version. That means every time we change something within the library, we need to deploy all the micro frontends and all the shells to be on the safe side. Well, to be completely honest, there is a way to define a version within the monorepo, but you need to do it by hand. When you go with NPM packages, module federation takes this version out of the package JSONs, of the package JSON of the provider and the consumer. But here in this case, you could provide a version by hand. But more likely, you would go with an evergreen version approach when having a monorepo. And so you have just this shared library and you deploy everything when changing the shared library.
I see. Thank you for your answer. We have another question from Massimo. How do you exchange data between the shell and the micro frontends, events and such?
Yeah, the same way. You need a shared library. And this shared library could define, let's say, a blackboard. I'm writing something into it. I'm reading something from it. This is the easiest approach. But honestly, I would not go this direction because having a blackboard, an object both sides use, is coupling both sides to each other. Instead, I would go with message passing because message passing is really unobtrusive. That means one side can expose a message. Let's think about triggering an event, like a kick event, but this event is saying, hey, a new customer is selected, or hey, we have a new patient. And then all the other micro frontends can react upon this event or not. And so this does not assume that we have a specific amount and specific micro frontends in general in place.
I see. Maybe like a sub question to that, like in your example, we basically both the shell and the micro frontend were like Angular, and micro frontend like came like with its own routings and such, and it was kind of like routed to like from the shell, right? So because they are both Angular, would it be possible like in a micro frontend to inject some services like which are like provided in the shell, or this is totally decoupled?
It is possible because module federation can be configured quite in a flexible way. But honestly, if we work together with the CLI, it would be the easiest approach to just take this file you want to share, move it into a library, and tell Webpack Federation to share this library. In theory, also sharing something within the shell would work, but in practice, going with the separated library is far easier.
Thank you. We have another question from Jan Sobota, which is about like if yeah, like I guess it's again like about the communications, about like using like a shared worker or like some broadcast channel to communicate. So what would be like your preferred recommendation?
Shared worker or broadcast channel, yeah, I have seen both working in practice. So I think there is not a big difference when it comes to achieving the goal of communication. I mainly use just a shared object, which is providing a message broker. But at the end of the day, a shared worker can also act as a message broker. So I would say just take the thing you feel more comfortable with.
Thank you. Next question from Nicola. Does it make sense using NGRX on the shell for simplifying communication between micro frontends? Could this be somehow like integrated? Like we have, for example, like some global store in the shell, and then those micro frontends kind of like register their own like state slices into that global store.
So technically it's possible because module federation loads everything into the same namespace, especially if we share Angular core, Angular common, and perhaps NGRX store. So technically it's possible, but I would not try to access parts of another micro frontends because micro frontends are all about isolation. We don't want to couple ourselves to another micro frontend because we want the teams to work separately. And so, yeah, go with a feature store, but don't assume anything else in other branches owned by other micro frontends. If you need to communicate, limit it to a minimum. Most of the time, you can live with a handful of properties. The rest you can load by yourself from your backend. And for this, use a tiny message broker, a service with a behavior subject, a service with a replace subject, or even a shared worker.
What about like as a sub question, what about like providing like those micro frontends with like some base state, like about authentication, like from the shell? Would that work?
Yeah, totally. This would one of those tiny pieces I'm sharing.
Yeah.
Perhaps I'm sharing a security token. I'm just emitting an event, a domain event logged in, user has logged in, and the payload contains this token. Perhaps I'm also defining that there is a well-defined location for the token, the current session store under this or that location. And so each and every micro frontend can grab it from the session store.
Thank you. We have another question from Luca. Does this work only with micro frontends that are using Angular, or could it be made work with micro frontends using other frameworks like Vue, AngularJS, Hybrid, Angular, AngularJS, React?
Yeah, it totally works. The thing is, only thing you need to do is not exposing a Vue component in this case, but exposing a web component that is wrapping a Vue component. In this case, you can seamlessly load everything into the world of Angular and use it there.
Okay, thank you. And now, like for the last question, or was it? Yeah, Marco was asking, what is the hint in the case of a big app shell with a large number of like micro frontends? So hint like, I'm not sure if I understand the question correctly, but like, I guess like what this should be like the ratio of the logic between like the shell or micro frontends or something like this, or if feel free, Marco, like to clarify your question further while Manfred is replying.
Mm-hmm. So was it more about why you should do this, why you should create a shell having tons of micro frontends?
I guess maybe it was also about like the ratio of like logic which should go to shell and to micro frontend.
The ratio, yeah.
I guess.
I would say the shell should be as slim and as dumb as possible. In the best case, it just does, I'm calling it meter routing between application and establishing some way of communication. This is everything the shell should do. Perhaps also authentication, but all the use cases, all the use case specific stuff should be in microfrontends.
Okay, so that was our last question. One more thing, thank you very much that you provided like the community with like this npm package, which basically enables you to like get this builder out of the box, which like prepares all this stuff for you to experiment, because this is extremely valuable, like to get you started. And yeah, thank you again for the talk. Wish you an amazing day and hopefully see you soon somewhere.
I thank you, mille grazie, and have a nice day.
Ciao.
Ciao.